Most people think these habits are flaws. They're not. Staying quiet when a meeting gets heated, slowing down when everyone else is speeding up, doing less on purpose when the pressure is highest. From the outside, those behaviors look like disengagement or fear or just not caring enough. But there's a different explanation, one that's about 2,500 years old and still more accurate than anything modern productivity culture has come up with. This list is a diagnostic. If you recognize yourself in these habits, you're not behind, you're not broken, you might just be operating closer to something the Taoists called mastery. Number 4 is the one your boss almost certainly misreads. Stay for it. Habit 1, you go quiet when others escalate. Picture a room where something just went wrong. A deadline got missed, a deal fell apart, someone said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person. Watch what happens next. Most people in that room start filling the air with explanations, with defenses, with noise, and then there's one person who doesn't. They go still, not frozen, not checked out. Still, watching. That person makes everyone else uncomfortable. Silence in a high-pressure moment reads as a threat, or as weakness, or as not having anything to offer. Co-workers assume that if you're not reacting, you must not care. Managers wonder if you're even engaged. The cultural default is that urgency demands a response, and a visible one, but here's what's actually happening. In Taoist thought, Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. It means not forcing. The sage doesn't match the energy in the room, because matching energy is just a different way of being controlled by it. When everyone else escalates, the person who stays quiet isn't absent from the situation. They're outside the pull of it. That's a completely different thing. Think about how silence actually functions in a room full of anxious people. It creates pressure without a word. When you stop talking, other people start filling the gap, and they fill it with information they wouldn't have given you if you'd kept going. Negotiators know this. Therapists know this. The person who holds silence longest in a tense conversation tends to shape where it lands, because everyone else is scrambling to resolve the discomfort that silence creates. You don't direct the conversation by dominating it. You direct it by not being moved by it. This isn't passivity. It's pressure regulation. The Taoists would say the sage bends like water, not because water is weak, but because water doesn't waste energy fighting the shape of the container. It moves through. The person going quiet in a heated moment is doing exactly that. Not resisting, not retreating, moving through. If you're the person who slows down internally when everything externally speeds up, that's not a flaw in how you handle stress. That's the habit, and it connects directly to what comes next, because silence is one thing. But what about when you actually pull back your output? Habit 2, you do less when the stakes get higher. Every productivity framework you've ever encountered will tell you the same thing. When it matters most, do more. Work longer, push harder, add another meeting, build a bigger plan. The cultural story around high stakes is that they require maximum effort, and anyone who responds to pressure by simplifying or pulling back is either not serious or not capable. So when you're the person who, under real pressure, starts cutting meetings, cutting tasks, cutting the list down to almost nothing, it looks like you're giving up. It looks like you're not taking it seriously. The Tao Te Ching describes water constantly, not because it's poetic, but because water actually demonstrates the principle. Water doesn't force its way through rock. It finds the path that's already there, and it stays on it. More force from water doesn't carve the canyon faster. Time and consistency do. The master's version of high-stakes output isn't addition, it's removal. Clear the path, let the thing move. There's real science underneath this. Research on decision fatigue shows that the quality of choices drops as the number of choices and the volume of effort increases, not because people get lazy, but because the cognitive load of managing complexity crowds out the actual thinking. Roy Baumeister's work on ego depletion pointed to this pattern consistently. The more decisions people crammed into a day, the worse the later ones got. More effort, worse results. The Taoist master figured that out without a lab. Doing less under pressure isn't about withdrawing from the situation. It's about removing the friction you're generating yourself. Most of the additional effort people apply in high-stakes moments doesn't produce results. It produces the feeling of doing something, which is not the same thing. The master knows the difference. They ask what's actually necessary, cut everything else, and move cleanly through whatever's left. That's not laziness, it's load management. The person who strips a crisis down to its 3 real variables and works only those variables is operating at a higher level than the person running 15 parallel work streams in a panic. Doing less with your effort is something most people can accept, at least in theory. The next habit is harder because it's not about what you do. It's about what you say, and more specifically, what you stop saying after you've already said it once. Habit 3. You don't defend your ideas. You say your piece. You say it clearly once, and then you stop. No follow-up email making the same case with different words. No returning to it in the next meeting. No pulling people aside afterward to make sure they understood what you meant. You put the idea down and you walk away from it. In almost every professional environment, that reads as indifference. The assumption is that if you believed in something, you'd fight for it. The loudest advocate in the room wins. Not always because they're right, but because persistence signals conviction, and conviction gets mistaken for quality. So the person who states a position once and lets it sit looks like they either don't care or don't have the confidence to back it up. The Taoists had a very specific word for what's actually happening. It's not indifference, it's non-attachment. The sage doesn't cling to being right, because the moment you start defending an idea, you're no longer working with the idea, you're working with your identity, and those are 2 completely different problems. The Tao Te Ching opens with the line that the Tao which can be named is not the eternal Tao, and one reading of that is straightforward. As soon as you lock something down and start protecting it, you've already lost the thing you were trying to protect. Ideas are living. The grip kills them. There's also a practical mechanism here that has nothing to do with philosophy. In negotiation research, over-advocacy triggers what's called psychological reactance. When people feel pushed, they push back, not because the idea is bad, but because the pressure itself activates resistance. The harder you sell, the more you make the other person's position about not being sold to. You're no longer debating the idea, you're debating who gets to control the outcome. Letting go of the idea removes that entirely. The idea can then be evaluated on its own terms, without the friction of your ego attached to it. This is one of the stranger relabels on this list, because it asks you to separate yourself from your own thinking in a way that feels almost counterintuitive. Your idea isn't you. Letting it go isn't losing. It's releasing your ego from the outcome, which is the only way to find out if the idea was actually good in the first place. Not defending your ideas takes a certain kind of detachment. The next habit goes one step further, and most people find it even harder because it asks you to do something that actively looks like you don't have the answers at all. Habit 4. You ask questions instead of giving answers. Walk into any high-stakes meeting and pay attention to who speaks in statements and who speaks in questions. The people making statements are demonstrating what they know. The people asking questions are doing something else entirely, and in most rooms it doesn't look impressive. Questions read as uncertainty. They read as not being prepared or not being confident enough to take a position. In a culture where expertise means having answers ready, someone who keeps asking looks like they haven't done the work. The Taoist concept here comes from 2 directions at once. There's the line from the Tao Te Ching, knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is enlightenment, which points to inquiry as the deeper practice, not the lesser one. And then there's what Zhuangzi called the empty cup. A mind already full can't receive anything new. The master isn't someone who's accumulated enough answers to stop asking. The master is someone who understands that the asking never stops, because the situation is always changing, and your last answer was built for a slightly different problem. The person with all the answers has stopped listening. That's not a character flaw. It's just what happens when you're managing what you already know instead of gathering what you don't. The person asking questions is still in contact with the room. They're picking up signals the other person missed because they were busy confirming what they already believed. Leadership research on the Socratic method backs this up in ways that are hard to argue with. Managers who lead with questions rather than directives consistently outperform those who lead with answers, particularly in complex and fast-moving environments where the situation on the ground changes faster than any one person's expertise can track. Asking is not a softer version of knowing. In the right hands, it's a more precise instrument. So if you're the person in the room who responds to a hard situation with, "What do you think is actually driving this?" instead of a confident-sounding answer you're not fully sure about, that's not a gap in your knowledge. It's information asymmetry management. You're closing the distance between what you know and what's actually true, which is the only move that matters when the stakes are real. We're almost at number 1. And it's the habit that looks the most like failure from the outside. But first, there's a habit that sits right in the middle of this list that almost nobody talks about. And it's about the things you never finish. Habit 5. You're comfortable not finishing things. Hustle culture has a very clean moral story about quitting. It goes like this: people who finish things are strong, and people who don't are weak, and the distance between those two categories is willpower. So if you're someone who regularly walks away from projects midstream, drops goals that no longer feel right, or lets conversations end without resolution, you've probably absorbed the message that something is wrong with you, that you lack follow-through, that you're not disciplined enough to see things out. The Tao Te Ching, chapter 44, says it plainly: to know when to stop is to avoid danger, not as a concession, as instruction. The sage doesn't finish things for the sake of finishing them, because completion for its own sake is just a different form of control. You're serving the original decision instead of the current situation. What made sense when you started might not make sense now, and insisting on finishing anyway isn't discipline. It's stubbornness dressed up as integrity. Think about what actually drives the inability to quit. It's not commitment. It's the sunk cost fallacy, which is the cognitive pattern where the resources you've already spent feel like a reason to keep spending. Behavioral economists have documented this extensively. Hal Arkers and Catherine Bloomer ran studies in the 1980s showing that people would endure worse outcomes rather than write off prior investment, even when the rational move was obvious. The money was already gone. The time was already spent. Continuing didn't recover it. It just added more loss to the pile. People who could cut early, cleanly, consistently outperformed people who held on. The Taoist framing for this isn't about giving up. It's about staying aligned with what's actually alive in a situation versus what you're keeping alive through sheer force of commitment. A project that drained its energy 6 weeks ago isn't waiting to be rescued by more effort. It's asking to be released. The master reads that signal and acts on it without the guilt, because guilt is just the sunk cost fallacy wearing an emotional costume. If you're someone who can walk away without the spiral of self-recrimination, without the need to justify the exit to everyone who knew you started, that's not a character flaw. That's energy redirection. You're not quitting, you're reallocating towards something that still has traction. The first 5 habits on this list have all been about internal states, how you process pressure, how you manage effort, how you hold your ideas. The next one is about something you can actually observe from the outside, and it's probably the most consistently misread signal on this entire list. Habit 6. You move at a noticeably different speed. There's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from moving through a room at a pace that doesn't match the room. Too deliberate when everyone's rushing, too settled when the energy is frantic. You're not slow exactly, you're just not synced to the urgency everyone else has agreed to operate inside, and in urgency culture, that reads as being out of step, uncommitted, maybe even a little checked out. The assumption underneath this is that speed signals seriousness. If something matters, you move fast on it. So the person who doesn't accelerate when everyone else does must not understand what's at stake, or must not care, or is simply falling behind and hasn't noticed yet. Lao Tzu wrote that nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. That line is easy to read as poetic and dismiss as impractical, but it's describing something mechanical. A river doesn't speed up because you're impatient to see it reach the ocean. A tree doesn't grow faster because the season feels urgent. The pace is set by the internal process, not by external pressure. And the output, the river reaching the sea, the tree producing fruit, happens anyway on that schedule, not yours. The reactive version of speed creates errors that cost more time than the speed saved. This isn't abstract. Sports science and military decision research both point to the same pattern. Performance under artificial time pressure degrades accuracy, increases errors, and often requires more total time to correct than a slower initial pace would have required. Going fast because the room is anxious is not the same as going fast because the moment actually demands it. The master knows the difference between those two things because one of them is self-generated pressure and the other is real. Chronobiology research adds another layer. People who work within their natural cognitive rhythm rather than against an externally imposed one sustain higher quality output over longer periods. The forced sprint is a borrowing. You're spending tomorrow's clarity today, and the bill comes due. So if you're the person whose pace doesn't match the collective anxiety of the room, and you've spent years wondering if that makes you less serious than everyone around you, it doesn't. Your pace isn't resistance to the situation, it's calibration to it. The last habit is the most internal one on this list, and from the outside, it probably looks the least like any kind of advantage at all. Habit 7. You find ordinary moments genuinely interesting. Most people treat the small stuff as the cost of getting to the big stuff. The meeting before the decision, the conversation before the deal, the pause before someone finally says what they actually mean. These are just friction to move through, not things worth paying attention to in themselves. So when you're the person who actually slows down for them, who notices the slight shift in someone's tone mid-sentence or gets genuinely absorbed in a problem's texture rather than just its solution, that reads as distraction, low ambition, getting lost in the weeds when you should be moving toward the point. Zhuangzi said the Tao is in the ant, in the broken tile, in excrement. He wasn't being provocative for effect. He was making a structural argument. The animating principle of everything doesn't live only in the important moments. It runs through all of them equally, and the person who can only find meaning in the large and obvious is working with a fraction of the available information. The sacred and the mundane aren't two different categories. They're the same thing at different scales. Most people live slightly ahead of themselves. The next task, the next outcome, the next conversation. Attention is always parked somewhere in the near future, which means the actual present moment gets processed on autopilot. The master has a different relationship to time, not because they've mastered some meditation practice, but because they've stopped treating now as the waiting room for later. This has direct consequences for decision quality. Research on present moment attention in leadership contexts, much of it building on the work coming out of mindfulness-based stress reduction programs and adapted for organizational settings, consistently shows that leaders who practice deliberate attention to what's actually in front of them make fewer reactive errors, not because they're calmer in some general sense, but because they're working with more complete information. The person running on autopilot is filling gaps with assumptions. The person paying attention is filling them with data. If you're someone who finds the small moments genuinely worth slowing down for, not as a technique, not as a discipline you've imposed on yourself, but because that's just how your attention naturally works, that isn't scattered focus, it's depth perception. You're seeing more of what's there, and that compounds over time in ways that are hard to measure and very easy to underestimate. These habits don't look like mastery, because mastery doesn't perform itself. Silence, reduction, release, inquiry, pace, presence, they all point the same direction, away from force and towards something that actually works. None of them announce themselves. That's exactly why they get misread. Tell me in the comments, which one of these do you already have without realizing it? And if you want to take this further, the next video covers the one Taoist concept that changes how you handle every conflict at work. Subscribe so you don't miss it.